My name's Daniel Brien. I'm at the Filecoin Foundation. One of the things that the Filecoin Foundation does is looks and keeps an eye on policy and regulation, so you don't have to. Um, I'm pretty sure everybody here is somewhat aware of the increasingly intriguing and fascinating geopolitical state that we find ourselves in. And we've definitely had a lot of feedback for folks asking, okay, what does this mean for Filecoin? What does it mean for our network, our global network, in an era of global instability? I actually gave an unconference talk about this at our last meetup, and I mainly concentrated on the very early signals that we were hearing at that point. That was in the beginning of this year. Um, and Unsurprisingly, a lot of that revolved around the realization by a lot of people that the traditional stewards of important public data, humanities data, may not be able to hold that for much longer. And that was sort of an increasing concern. And as many of you know, a bunch of the data that had been stored by the US government is backed up and replicated on Filecoin as a result of our collaboration with organizations like the Internet Archive and archivists around the world. So that is the thing that's going on, and we sort of touched upon that slightly. I actually want to try and do a second order thing here, because I think the most useful thing you can do in a time of uncertainty like this is to try and follow the through lines, right? I think we're well placed for storing humanities public knowledge. In many ways, the world is sort of catching up to the fact that institutions of any size, if they're centralized, become single points of failure and don't have the kind of resilience you really want to have for protecting civilization level knowledge. But there's a lot of other things that really are coded into how Filecoin works, that in the interaction with some of the sort of secondary effects of this gradual lowering in trust between institutions, and particularly between nation states, we can step up and take advantage of. Somebody who watched my earlier talk said that I should title it Chaos is a Ladder. I don't think that that's quite what I'm trying to say here, but I think one of the ways I can sort of point this out is drill down to some of the long-term trends we're seeing in policy and extrapolate to where we can go to meet the puck, as it were. Let me delve into this idea of decentralized data in a world of borders. As has been said before by Molly, our network and the network of knowledge is global but local. That has a particular effect when borders are increasing. And I'm not really necessarily talking just about tariffs here. Let's pull out to a sort of wider view of the trends that we're seeing here. So this is a map of countries with data localization regulations. That's to say, jurisdictions which require some or all data held about their own citizens to be held locally. The number one there in the early 70s was forward-looking countries like Sweden, and actually hosts to FDS6 in real life. Canada did a lot of thinking about this, the EU as well. A lot of this was about data protection, right? Protecting personal information. And the idea here is that if you store data physically where your nation state was, you could place some sort of controls on how that data was used or misused. And if any of you were tracking sort of the tensions between the US and the EU when companies like Facebook and Google began to use that personal data in ways that they felt weren't in accordance with data protection law, it was this that kicked in, the idea that you can't export that data to countries that don't comply with those data protection limits. That little spike in 2010 going up to 2020 is a new feature, which is sort of actually about national security. If you've ever heard the phrase national digital sovereignty, it's not the data sovereignty that we think about in the Web3 world. It's the idea that a country should be able to control its network. And so that comes from countries like Russia, who require companies to keep data locally so that they can potentially punish those companies or place controls on them if they disobey other rules in those environments. So, for instance, Russia compels companies to store data on its soil, and therefore, if they violate, for instance, the censorship practices of Russia, they can be punished because they have some institutional presence. Um, I'm going to drill down a little bit into one particular feature of this that exposes kind of the problem here. This is the Cloud Act. The Cloud Act was actually a US proposed law that was passed in 2018, and it sort of unwinds at all of this data localization approaches. What the Cloud Act does is says that the United States, no matter where data is stored in the rest of the world, as long as that data is accessible or controlled by a US corporation or a company that has a US presence, the US government can reach in through that access and get that data and pull it out. In particular, they were trying to get data from Ireland, and the US court said, well, you don't have access to that data because it's stored somewhere else. So what this gave is the US the power to actually just go through multinationals to seize this data. That caused a kind of, well, I wouldn't say a breakdown in trust. It's sort of, when it was originally written, it sort of expected the countries to be it was trusting. It was a sort of carrot rather than a carrot and stick. They said, we'll take this data, but you can challenge our access to it. Companies can, if the country that we're seizing that data from has laws against it, and they count as a qualifying country, which is to say a country that the US likes and feels copacetic in terms of its human rights. I think you can see where this is going. In the modern state, that trust has broken down, which means that increasingly companies and countries no longer trust other countries to follow those rules, right? To do a quid pro quo in this environment. And I want to emphasize here, this doesn't really matter about whether you think these countries will legitimately break these rules, right? The question here is, do people trust those rules enough? Do they trust the rule of law to have these kind of protections? And that's true of both companies and of jurisdictions. Um, in a world like that, a multipolar world like that, centralized storage suffers some problems, right? Cloud storage is multinational. That means that those companies can be affected by all the jurisdictions they're in, which means they're conflicted, right? They have to protect, or they want to protect their users, but they also don't want to go to jail. And they also want to sort out a deal between those different jurisdictions. They're homogenous. You don't get a solution by in this sort of multipolar conflicted world by moving from Google to Amazon and back again. All of these multinationals face this same problem, and they're codependent, right? They all live within and die within this world. Um, as Molly correctly said, the Filecoin network works slightly differently. Like our storage providers are deliberately, we've engineered the crypto economics so that they are separate not only from a sort of multinational, from a centralized point of view, but also operate potentially in decentralized jurisdictions. So they're local, they're independent from anybody apart from their customers, right, that they're serving more or less directly. They're diverse. They have different business models potentially. They have different ideas about the best way of serving their customers. And the uncorrelated, right? What happens in one country with one storage provider is not connected to another. And for customers, they can move between those storage providers that are whose threat model is uncorrelated relatively easily, thanks to content addressability and the nature of the Filecoin network. Okay, I may have overrun. I apologize. I thought I would just catch one narrow little glimpse, but I've gone too far, too deep. Um, I wanted to put in a little bit here about ways that we can continue to engineer the Filecoin network to take advantage of these. I hesitate to call them opportunities. It's not going to be necessarily a pleasant time to live in the next few years as we sort out how to do this. But here are some of the ways and some of the systems that we could build into Filecoin or third parties can help build in. We've talked about reputation systems for storage providers. I think verified on-chain metadata about those storage providers, so customers know what they're getting and can choose between them. User-controlled access control. One of the things that we want to avoid in this world is where, as in decentralized networks, as in centralized networks, the access control is managed by a central authority, and so if that central authority is vulnerable to attack by a legal or illegal actor, they can get access to the crown jewels. That's a really fundamental flaw in centralized systems, which we can get around with token-based systems like UCANs. ZK services that reflect contractual requirements are incredibly useful. Greater geolocational diversity, we've talked about previously, and also creating new opportunities for SBs so they can become increasingly diverse from the centralized offerings and from each other, so people can pick and choose in a truly free market of storage that works globally but acts locally. Thank you.